Ntate David, I no longer have the energy to live. My body is broken. And I don't know anymore. I used to be excited about life, but now there's nothing to live for. Now, with that, I want us to go back in history, and please forgive the errata and so on in this presentation. I rushed it because we were very busy this week. But I start off with gold, and I ask myself, you know, when you go through school, I went through school, and we were taught that mining started in 1868 in Kimberley and 1886 in Johannesburg, and before that, the indigenous people of South Africa were roaming around. They were not settled. They didn't live in large towns or cities, and they were basically herders and cultivators, and some of them were hunters and gatherers. Yet in later years, when I started studying the history of the country, I found interesting references, for example, from as early as the time of Van Riebeeck already in 1652, that people, Khoisan people who traded with the Dutch at the Cape, had wonderful copper and tin jewelry, beads and so on. And my video is on. My video is on. Can you hear me? Am I audible? My screen doesn't
yes, you're
work.
audible.
Yes,
fine, David, you're fine.
Yeah. Okay, my slide doesn't want to go to the next slide for some reason.
Okay, what I've done, David, sorry, your slides were very small, so I put it to my screen. So just tell me when you want to go to the next slide.
Okay. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. So as I was saying, Van Riebeeck and the Dutch East India Company were amazed by the copper and tin jewelry that was worn by Khoisan people who traded in cattle and a whole range of other goods with the Dutch East India Company. Now, as early as the 12th century AD, the Arab historian El Idrisi wrote of large gold nuggets found in the country of Sofala. That is the country to the west of where is Beira today in Mozambique. And from Arab trading posts in the interior, they carried on a lively trade in gold. The large numbers of ancient mine workings north and south of the Limpopo was linked to this trade and involved the cities of Mapungupu and Great Zimbabwe, and probably the Mwene Mutapa, Changamire, and Roswy empires. You know, and a lot of this literature is available. You know, this the Transvaal Chamber of Mines, you know, Jeppe Street, CP Jeppe was a big miner in Johannesburg, and he wrote about some of this stuff in some of the books that he wrote. And the picture that you see there now, that picture is, if you move to the next slide, Dale, that picture that you see there now, the third slide, you see there are copper bangles, there's a needle, there's a needle holder, and so on. You know, and this was captured by Andrew Smith when he had a trip into the interior in 1834, just to prove what we were saying. Now, according to Portuguese records, there were plenty of alluvial mining operations in the interior of the Mozambican coast. However, there were hundreds of underground mines and tunnels between 300 and 500 years old at Pilgrim's Rest, in the Makado Soutpansberg area, in Mapox, Gronden, in the Leidenburg district, and Waterval onder and elsewhere. Now, the interesting thing about modern mining, and I've read this in the records of some of the big mining companies, that in many cases, they simply looked for where the pre-colonial mines were. They didn't have to do much geological investigation to find where they would find gold and other minerals. So in other words, just like in Burkina Faso today, where the French companies are pushing off artisanal miners from the land to take over that land for big industrial mining, in the 19th century, basically a lot of the indigenous people got pushed off the land and pushed off the areas where the minerals were concentrated and where in fact they were mining. If you read John Campbell's travels in the interior of South Africa, he speaks extensively also there of the iron and so on that was produced at Khadichwene near Zeerust, and you know, the other metals and so on that people were wearing at that time. Now, some of the underground workings are extensive, according to Jeppe. Several thousands of tons have been removed in places to a depth of 50 feet. That's about 25 meters or so. In southern Zimbabwe, there are nearly 1,000 such gold workings. They average about 75 meters deep, 2 meters wide, and 100 meters long. Now, we often wonder why Zimbabweans are such good artisanal miners, and that's because they had a very long history of artisanal mining, going back long before colonialism. Estimates of the rocks recovered are as high as 2 million to 3 million tons of rocks came out of these artisanal mines that existed before large-scale industrial mining and modern mining in Southern Africa. Here is a picture. If you go to the next slide, Dale, there is a picture of people smelting minerals and processing minerals and the tools and equipment that they used. I've personally visited some of these old Iron Age sites in the areas around Zeerust and so on. There are still smelting ovens and so on. There's lots of these stones and so on that they use, and the other instruments that they use lying around in those particular areas. Of course, none of those things are protected because we don't respect the history that is written on the landscape of our country, because that history contradicts the modern history of South Africa, which is all about industrialization and the majority of people just being employees for big mining companies, cheap labor for the farms and so on, rather than people that had kingdoms, big towns and cities, and actually engaged in mining and the processing of minerals. Now, copper and tin, equally very large numbers of copper and tin mines existed from Katanga, where you had the Lubalunda Empire in the north of Zambia and the south of Congo, right down to the Northern Cape. In South Africa, such artisanal mines existed at Musina. This is copper and tin mines, Palabora, Rooiberg, Leeupoort, and the Waterberg. Thousands of tons of copper and tin must have been mined from them, according to Jeppe. Now, European traders, hunters, missionaries, and so-called explorers wrote about the iron products from the iron mines and smelters operated by the Tswana, the Venda, and the Nguni people. And it's quite interesting because ISCOR, in a publication that they launched in the 1960s, referred to the iron and so on that was mined and processed in pre-colonial times. Now, both David Livingstone as well as Campbell referred to the good quality of the iron that came out from these processing plants in the Northwest Province and so on, and the amount of iron that was produced there. Now, the question that we should answer is, why is this relevant? Why is this history important? Well, the first one I've already mentioned. Our children and we ourselves are not taught that artisanal mining was very common. It was the dominant form of mining before colonialism. Modern industrial mining is closely associated with colonialism and the alienation of the indigenous population from the land and resources of our country. So, in other words, the old racist argument that I often hear from racists when you talk about these things to them, they say, what have Africans ever done? You know, ignoring the fact that colonialism took everything that was done in Asia, Africa, and the Americas and so on to Europe, and then represented itself to the world as if it was the products of Europe, when in actual fact, these were simply the products of conquest and colonialism and so on. Now, It is also important because as large-scale industrial mining become less and less viable or profitable, it is necessary to develop frameworks for orderly survival, small-scale and medium-scale mining. We've got 6,000 abandoned mines in South Africa. Now, those mines still contain minerals, but they're not profitable for large-scale industrial mining. But certainly they could be profitable for mining driven directly by communities on a small, medium, and survival scale. And like in the old times, they would lead to the development or the manufacturing of use values rather than just exchange values. Artisanal mining was needs-based and therefore directly linked to manufacturing of useful tools and jewelry. Large-scale industrial mining is foreign-owned, and the minerals simply get shipped out of the country, preventing the development of a manufacturing economy in this country. Large-scale mining is also more environmentally destructive and dangerous to community health and safety. Then I just need to say a few things about how we came to be where we are, because if we look at Johannesburg in 1886, it was a squatter camp of zinc shacks, of buckets and spades, exactly the kind of thing that you see along Main Reef Road at the moment. It was zama-zamas operating until the big industrialists, the landlords, the people with money came in, pushed the people off the land that were there, and then consolidated all of that into big industrial mining companies. And with that, of course, they constructed the laws and the legislative environment within which large-scale industrial mining would benefit at the cost not only of small-scale mining, but also at the cost of local people. So Cecil John Rhodes passed a variety of laws such as the Glen Grey Act, land laws, tax laws, and so on, that forced Black people in the Eastern Cape off the land to go and work in his mines in Kimberley. Later on, that same model was exported to Zimbabwe, to Mozambique, to Malawi, to Zambia, and so on, to push people from those countries back into South Africa and into the mines in this particular country. So right from the very beginning of industrial mining, people were brought in with stimuli, the train that came and picked up the men and took the healthy men to Igoli. And there in Igoli, they disgorged and worked in the mines, only to come back broken and sick and used up basically as cheap labor in this very profitable mining industry, which was hugely profitable for the British Empire. You know, few people know this, but after the Second World War, Britain was extremely happy about the discovery of the Free State goldfields because they needed to repay the debts they incurred in that particular war. And much of the money for those debts came from the gold of the Free State. And the Free State goldfields developed immediately after the Second World War. And I think this will take us into the discussion about the laws and the legislation and so on. Just safe to say that anyone who denies artisanal mining denies the very history of this country, the very identity of the people of this country, because this was something that they did for hundreds of years before colonialism. I think I'll end there.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I think that gives us a really good historical background and reality check in terms of the way in which oftentimes artisanal mining is presented to us. And as we said, the ahistorical nature of that, and the sort of pejorative terms and the ways in which people think, as you mentioned, that this does not have a long history of very skilled individuals and people who have been making a living from artisanal small-scale mining for a long period of time. So thanks for setting that record straight and laying that foundation. Welcome, Khotatso. I saw that you joined us, and we will be coming to you after Lauren, who is going to be next. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome. David van Veek just provided the first input on the history of artisanal small-scale mining and setting that record straight. Lauren Nell, who is going to be our next presenter, just to reintroduce her, She's an attorney formerly with the Legal Resources Center and has been working for quite some time with the National Artisanal Miners Association, as well as on these issues. She will be speaking to us about the legislative and legal side of things and some of the challenges there. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Dale. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. So as Dale stated, I'm going to be talking about the mapping of the journey/struggle for recognition and formalization of informal and artisanal miners, predominantly obviously in South Africa. As Dale also stated, was an attorney at the LRC, and I worked with sort of the legal framework regarding artisanal miners and trying to formalize the practice in South Africa. As David obviously presented on, artisanal miners wasn't a new idea. It was something that was here long before large-scale miners came in. So the first recognition that we saw in South Africa was the 1998 white paper. And what it spoke about for artisanal miners was firstly the definition of what they were. And it spoke about the ideas of having access to mineral rights, access to finance, access to markets, technologies and skills, as well as institutional support. The next recognition we see of artisanal miners is only in 2009 on a regional level from the African Union in the African Mining Vision, which stated that the harnessing of the potential of artisanal and small-scale mining to improve rural livelihoods, to stimulate entrepreneurship in a socially responsible manner, to promote local and integrated national development, as well as regional cooperation. The International Labour Organization also commented on this in 2007, saying there was too many regulations in place that didn't allow for the legalization of artisanal miners and too few inspectors to assist with artisanal mining. We then in 2018 see quite a lot of conflict around artisanal mining, with the first case of Maludu and others versus Ichirleng, Bakatle Mineral Resources and another. Why this case is important is obviously was artisanal miners that came into conflict over land and their practice. But what's more important is what the court said about it, about artisanal miners. And they said, obviously, if you strip someone of their source of livelihood, you strip them of their dignity too. However, in contradiction to this, in 2018, there was another case, which was the De Beers case. And this case saw the criminalization of artisanal miners being entrenched in South Africa, with comments obviously being made around the fact that the illegal practice could not be condoned by the court, and therefore a final interdict was granted against illegal artisanal miners from entering the property, processing, and mining and prospecting for diamonds. As I said, they obviously got an interdict against them as they were trying to gain access to the abandoned floors of the De Beers mining practice. And the word abandoned is extremely important here, as De Beers was not using these floors of the mine. And they were just trying to obviously make a living, to fend for themselves and their families in regards to their practice of artisanal mining. However, as I stated, the court said that they could not condone illegal activities of artisanal miners. However, that case of De Beers versus Sequoia led to the formation of the Kimberley Batopelo Cooperative. And they were the cooperative or the persons who were involved in the case against De Beers. And because of political pressure, because of protesting, they were finally given mining permits in the areas of the abandoned floors in De Beers. However, I have met with the Batopelo Cooperative before. The project hasn't been as successful as we would have liked it to be. And that was due to certain issues like lack of information being given, on how mining rights work, what kind of environmental authorizations are required, how you trade in minerals, and having an access point to be able to trade with minerals, such as the buyers involved. Obviously, previously, because their activities were not condoned by the law, they were using illegal buyers. And when they were given mining permits, they weren't given the resources of a sort of a local buyer's entity to be able to sell their minerals to. There was also problems because not everyone was given mining permits to the area. And so you had conflict between different groups of artisanal miners on the ground and competing interests that were taking place. And thirdly, there was lack of support in their practices. One instance was they had an issue with another group of individuals who were conducting themselves in a manner that was very volatile against the cooperative. And they did go to the police station to report this incident. And as they had previous run-ins with the police sort of didn't want to assist them. As they said, they had previously been criminals. And this recognition they had been given by these mining permits did not count to the police. And therefore, they wouldn't assist them even if they reported legitimate crimes that were going on. In 2019, the Legal Resources Center started working on the project with me being involved. And what we did was we held a roundtable with various stakeholders in regards to formalization of artisanal mining. And the thing that made this roundtable very unique was the fact that we actually had artisanal miners in the room with us. We brought in different civil society members. We also brought in the department or representation of the Department of Mineral Resources, and we brought in the police services. As obviously artisanal miners have huge conflict or come into contact with police services quite regularly, with a lot of police brutality being involved. What was interesting about obviously that engagement was the outputs that came from it. And what we asked people to do was to give recommendations to the state. And what came out of it is looking at, obviously the definitions of communities in terms of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, especially in terms of Section 104, which provides assistance to communities in light of them mining in their areas that they are situated. It was also asked that the definition of artisanal miners be specified, that artisanal miners have the right to mining in terms of the use it and lose it policy, as many of the mines that artisanal miners are working on have been abandoned, as we do have an issue with unrehabilitated mines in South Africa. That the Department of Mineral Resources needs to enforce mining laws and compliance, especially when it comes to large-scale miners. It needs to allow artisanal miners to be a part of the process of rehabilitation due to the issues of abandoned mines in South Africa. The state also needs to provide funding as well as provide skill training. There was also recommendations given to civil society to obviously provide skill development to artisanal miners, as well as look at legal advocacy and litigation. And then there was recommendations gave to specifically large-scale mining or mining companies to make available the unused or abandoned mines, to place artisanal small-scale miners and community members as obviously BE representatives, to assist artisanal miners in the marketing of their products to local communities, to set up trust funds to finance the community skills training for artisanal miners, to set up trust funds as well, and obviously to conduct meetings with affected communities when closing any mining company due to the issue of abandoned mines in South Africa. So why I mention all of this is this was sort of the foundations for the policy that was to come out. Prior to the policy coming out, there was 2 meetings that were conducted with Makua and NAM in 2019 with the Legislative Drafting Division of the Department of Mineral Resources. And the issues that were predominantly raised were, what are artisanal miners? and obviously the difference between an artisanal miner and an illegal miner. The other question raised, and this came from the Department of Mineral Resources, is should only South African citizens be involved? This was highly obviously opposed due to the background of the mining industry in South Africa, especially in the light of miners being brought from other countries into large-scale mines and making their lives here. And generationally, their children have stayed in the country. It was also raised the issue about what the state should provide in terms of support and what the role of the mining companies would be in terms of artisanal mining. Also in 2019, Benchmarks Foundation, IOREG, who's hosting this event, and the Legal Resources Center went into a coalition. And this coalition was a part of the pre-negotiations or the pre-submissions of the policy for artisanal and small-scale mining. And in these pre-consultations, the Legislative Drafting Division shared what their proposal would look like, what their project plans were, how their timelines would sit, and their initial views on the draft policy that they were creating. Through this process, it came clear again that they were only looking at permits for South African citizens. And obviously this was not supported by civil society. They also looked at the fact that maybe they should only be mining on the surface and not below ground. This obviously was also objected to due to the types of minerals that are involved in artisanal mining. There were suggestions about the funding models and the sort of policies that would be discussed. But obviously, again, it was put out there that there needed to be state funding to support artisanal and small-scale mining and to uplift previously disadvantaged individuals and mining communities. When it came to the non-negotiables of the policy, you need to first look at the Constitution and, you know, the right to equality, the right to dignity, the right to life of artisanal miners, the right to choose your own trade, occupation, or profession in terms of Section 22, and the right to a healthy environment, which includes the rights to obviously development in a sustainable manner and form. So the definition of artisanal mining was also discussed, which is extremely important. And the definition proposed was that artisanal mining has several different definitions, but it's generally understood to be small scale, informal, or unorganized mining that does not make use of sophisticated machinery. More specifically, many artisanal miners are informal miners who mine in abandoned mines or the tailings left behind and do this work to be able to support themselves and their dependents as their only means of income. Artisanal miners work independently and do not work with companies. So there was also obviously issues about the terms of how big the mining permits should be obviously allowed on. It was argued from the side of civil society that they needed to include in this obviously abandoned mines and the extent of abandoned mines. The state also needed to provide the expertise when it came to equipment, health and safety, and environmental authorizations. And also that the state actually had an obligation to assist artisanal miners in terms of Section 12 of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, and that they should look at only artisanal mining zones. So I'm just going to pass through some of these slides, but I will definitely send the slideshow. But just in terms of the general comments on the draft policy, we were informed by the Legislative Drafting Division, who drafted it, that they had only looked at certain African countries on the ground and done site visits, except the only country that they did not do a site visit in was actually South Africa. And so we had a strong recommendation that they had to do site visits in South African artisanal mines before coming up with this policy. Also that they needed to visit the Northern Cape artisanal miners, the Botswana cooperatives, due to what they could learn from the successes and failures of that project, as it was one of the key examples of artisanal miners being formalized in South Africa. Unfortunately, neither one of these recommendations was followed through with. And again, we then had the comment phase. The draft policy came out, and again, we had to reiterate the same submissions that we had done during the pre-consultations. So I'm going to skip over many of these slides, but the same things were argued about. The definition of artisanal mining didn't include the fact that these artisanal miners worked in abandoned mines or on tailings of mines that had been abandoned. It didn't include the fact that artisanal miners were there to support themselves and their dependents and were trying to find a means of income. The definition just stated to mean traditional and customary mining operations using traditional customary ways and means. This includes activities of individuals or groups using mostly rudimentary mining methods, manual and rudimentary tools to access mineral ore, usually available on surface or shallow depths. And so we can see from this definition that it lacks the background that David was talking about, and it lacks the foundations of what artisanal miners are engaging in, which is trying to support their families and dependents, as well as the fact that they are using abandoned mines or tailings of mines that have been left behind by large-scale mining. In terms of the hectares, we had the same arguments that there needed to be support. It needed to be in light of abandoned mines and the extent of the abandoned mines. And the state needed to provide health and safety as well as environmental authorizations for these types of projects. The duration of artisanal mining operations was also argued about, in the sense that artisanal miners are doing this as a sustainable practice, and therefore it cannot be limited in terms of years. Again, the power to demarcate areas came up, that the state would be entitled to demarcate artisanal mining zones. We also saw the reservation of permits to South Africans being brought up again. Even though this has been raised twice, obviously now, as I stated, from 2019, it still is obviously in the draft policy that we see for comments. And the submissions that are made by civil society seem to have been ignored by the state, as the policy that we kept being reintroduced to, or the ideas we keep being reintroduced to, are the same throughout the process. So just for clarity's sake, there was a section that was introduced of coexistence of large scale mines. It spoke about this idea of tributing agreements, which is actually a foreign terminology in South Africa. But what it results in is that obviously large scale mines enter agreements with artisanal miners to rent out their land to be able to mine on, and then will stand or use their sort of rights to be able to get technical support, equipment leasing schemes, and environmental authorizations. However, the prerequisite for this is that the large-scale mine would still have to be operating for the artisanal miners to be using or to be able to go into coexistence of large-scale mining operations. As I've stated, we do have an issue in South Africa with abandoned mines. And so this section doesn't particularly make sense because it would only allow large-scale mines to have the power to allow artisanal miners to enter the market on mines that they are currently working on. And the policy, even in its final form, doesn't speak about abandoned mines and how that can be used by artisanal mining practices on the ground. So I'm just going to move forward in terms of time to the actual implementation that takes place on the 30th of March, 2022. So this is the artisanal small-scale mining policy that now has been adopted. And the same ideas that I've just gone through, the same problems still seem to be in the policy itself. With the ideas of obviously it only being for South Africans still being in the policy, the definitions of artisanal mining and small-scale mining still being the same definitions that we are grappling with, which don't include the historical sort of foundations of artisanal mining in South Africa, or even appreciate artisanal miners for the fact that they are working on abandoned mines and trying to create a sustainable practice to be able to feed themselves and their families and to have some sort of income that comes in. Like I said, with the comparative studies that they did, they only attended to Kenya, Ghana, and Zambia. And even though they were referred to many times to do South African site visits, this never happened before the implementation of this policy. The types of permits that they look at are permits for artisanal and small-scale mining. Another issue that came out with the policy being implemented is it's first come, first serve. So whoever gets there first gets the mining permit. Again, you see obviously the duration and size being very similar to the draft that was put out for submissions. Once again, we see it's reserved only for South Africans, with a process being put in place for, as they put it, illegal immigrants, having a transitional period to be able to go to governments and sort of announce themselves. It's a very strange process that I don't see would be very successful, as most people who are in the country who do not have the relevant papers are not going to approach government or the police services due to the fact that they could be arrested, due to the fact that they could be removed from South Africa. And so we don't have a lot of clarity on what this transitional provision would look like. As I said, I'll share the slideshow. I'm just going through the most key point, value added points in the slideshow, but I will share the whole presentation. Again, the coexistence of large operations comes up with distributing agreements, which I did ask the Legislative Drafting Division what this terminology is. I didn't get a lot of clarity. Like I said, I believe it's sort of like a rental agreement that shall be entered into. It does come from foreign jurisdictions. It is not a South African term that we use in our contracts. Then we get to the institutional and support mechanisms. And as I've mentioned before, since 2019, artisanal miners have been asking for support. There will be sort of development of centralized regional mining offices that will be set up. In terms of financial assistance, the government's position is that they will not give financial assistance to artisanal miners, but they do encourage, obviously, that they approach funding institutions and they will assist in that. The forming of artisanal mining associations is compulsory. There's also formations of district mining committees, which will involve various stakeholders, including communities, including government, including artisanal miners, and that will assist with the licensing processes and dissemination of information. So one of the more important parts of the policy as well is the stance on illegal mining in South Africa. As we've seen, there's been recent sort of news about illegal mining in South Africa with the incident that happened in Krugersdorp. And the policy speaks about the fact that we must distinguish between artisanal miners and illegal miners. And there needs to be strengthening of the law in terms of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, the Criminal Procedures Act, the Precious Metals Act, the Second-Hand Goods Act, and the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. So what I just wanted to finish on is obviously in terms of the policy, we didn't get what we wanted as civil society through the submissions that were given, through the processes that we went through since 2019 with the Legislative Drafting Division. And now we have a policy that is in place for artisanal miners, and that is an accolade. The only problem is that the policy doesn't speak to all the issues that it needed to. The other issue is that the policy is just an idea. It doesn't have grounded concepts. It doesn't have law backing it up. We still have in the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act the criminalization of artisanal miners through the fact that unless you have a mining permit or mining rights, the activities of mining are illegal. And that illegality falls then through into the Criminal Procedure Act. And many artisanal miners are actually found guilty of trespassing versus the idea of not mining with the relevant permits or rights. And so the Trespassing Act would also need to be amended, as it's been used quite frequently against artisanal miners. The other acts that need to be looked at or need to be adjusted are how we transport minerals is determined in terms of the Diamond Act and the Precious Metal Act. So in the instance of the Batubele Cooperative, they were given mining permits to mine, but they were never told that they needed a permit for the diamonds they were carrying to carry them to a buyer. And therefore, the actual act of carrying minerals from where you mine it to the buyer needs to be considered, because if you do not have the necessary license to do that, it is considered an illegal act. So this is just all the law that I've mentioned that needs to be looked at. And then just to re-announce, obviously the section in terms of the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act, of the idea of assisting historically disadvantaged persons. The minister may facilitate assistance to any historically disadvantaged person to conduct prospecting or mining operations. And so obviously they consider various factors, but the financial position of the person, the need to transform the ownership structure of the minerals and mining industry, which is exactly what artisanal mining is about. And so this section is not recognized in terms of the artisanal and small scale mining policy. And just on a final point, with the policy, we need new laws enacted. We need amendments to the laws that we already have that criminalize or do not allow for artisanal mining. But also we need to discuss and understand the law behind the idea of tailings. So tailings and going through tailings is not an actual practice of mining. The only licenses or requirements you need are environmental authorization. So we need to be very clear when we talk about the law, whether it's mining or whether it's going through tailings. And there is case law to support that idea as well. And that would be the roadmap to artisanal mining and where we are right now. Sorry, Dave, I'm just trying to unshare my screen.
Yeah, it's unshared now. Is that it, Lauren? You done?
Yeah, that's everything. I think I took up more time than I was supposed to.
Yeah, no, it's no problems. No problem at all. Thank you so much, Lauren. I know there was a lot to cover there, and you did a really good job. I have just put in the chat, anyone who would like to receive a download for the link to record the recording of this webinar or the slide presentations of both Lauren and David. I'm not sure if Kotatsu is going to have one, but if she does as well, then you can just email me on that email address and I will send that to you, because I know that particularly there with Lauren's presentation, there were a lot of slides that she had to move through very quickly or moved over because of our time limitations. So thanks again, Lauren. That was a very comprehensive and I think very informative overview of the legislative and legal issues and some of the key problem areas that the artisanal and informal miners face with regards to regularization and formalization. I've noted, by the way, just to say, those of you who want to ask questions, when Kotatsu is done, we will then have a question and answer session. But please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I see there's 2 there already, which I've noted, or in the chat. So feel free. Now we're going to hand over to Kotatsu Nhlengetwa. Kotatsu is a special advisor to the National Association of Artisanal Miners. And she has also has her own consultancy and has worked a long time in this area. And we are looking to her to start to give us an overview of some of the realities on the ground as they exist, and particularly some of the more controversial areas that have come up with regards to criminal syndicates, the role of the police, and so forth. Kotatsu, welcome, and I'm over to you.
Hi, Dale. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dale, for giving me this opportunity. I think it's quite important, and I'm so glad that these conversations, it really makes a difference when also someone who can kind of be the voice for artisanal miners to kind of step up. Just to give a brief background, I've been working with the National Association of Artisanal Miners since about 2019, early 2019. And since then, really, we have seen that there has been now at least recognition. But even though there is that recognition, there seems to be a wrong approach to kind of looking over how it can be formalized as an artisanal mining space that can do and make a difference in the economy. So I'm just going to go through some major themes. I'm going to look at the legality and legal versus informal nature. I don't have a presentation, but I do have notes, and I will provide you with the notes, Dale, so that you can just share with everyone. So NAM as well, I'm going to look at how NAM is also organizing, just speak a bit about that. Look at corruption versus what happened at Batupili. Look at the formalization and what do we call formalization. Look a bit on mining value chain, some of the successes that are global. Look at some of the geoscience and some of the more scientific and technological approaches. And lastly, I will just leave you with some questions on formalization.
Kotatsu,
All right.
I'm just sorry.
The major difference now when I'm talking about Zamazamas and artisanal miners is that most people at the current moment don't realize artisanal miners see a distinction that is not necessarily academic.
Kotatsu, can you hear us?
Can you hear me, Dale?
Yeah, so just turn off your video because your bandwidth is very low. So we'll just listen to you, okay?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. I was just saying, please turn off your video so we save the bandwidth. Your connection is not great.
Okay, no, that's perfect. No, that's fine.
Unfortunately, we seem to have lost Kotatsu. It seems like she is in a area that is, we got very, very bad connections. So hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us. But while we wait for her, I'm going to, here she comes back again. So that was very quick. Hold on just a second.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Just go ahead.
The plugs dropped out here. Okay. So now let me just go back to my notes here. Yes. So artisanal miners are actually considered themselves, the name in isiZulu is Bafuguzi, which means the workers. And they consider themselves the more customary, traditional, and more community-based miners that are not so invasive, that are not gang-related, and that are not part of syndicates. And those are what we consider artisanal miners, whereas Zamazama mining is the more invasive, going into abandoned gold mines, syndicate-based, typically trafficked, and been done so with false pretenses of what is on the other side of a South African life. So this legal versus illegal versus informal is a very tricky line, and it's often not explicitly set out, like Lauren had alluded to the policy that, you know, even the definitions are not that clear of what really is artisanal mining. So it's something that's very tricky, and the policy needs to speak to that as well. The one thing that the policy does call for, which NAM did agree with, especially when we put our commentary through, was the fact that there must be some sort of associations of artisanal miners. And that's why NAM does exist, because it's actually an association of miners doing things for themselves, even though sometimes it's hard to do it, trying to do it with the funds that they irk out. But they're doing it by themselves anyway. And there is some successes, which I'll mention at the end, that NAM has had, and that we are still going through our own transformation and growth. For example, there's a lot of our members that are forming cooperatives, and sometimes even those that don't want to be our members form cooperatives and ask advice. And as a special advisor to all artisanal miners, really, not just NAM, because of my passion, I also advise them on cooperatives. I liked when Lauren spoke about strive for dignity through livelihood, and that's exactly even in the slogan for NAM is striving for our dignity back, you know. And it's very important that we can eke out a living for the artisanal miners so that they can actually feel like they can be able to support the livelihood, because we know that even has a psychological effect on things like breadwinners and such. One thing that I always talk about that I wanted to mention without a doubt is how there's corruption to the top levels. Sometimes it does include people in political spaces, people in high influential places, even in corporate. Police brutality is a thing. And, you know, they're treated all the same. Although I mentioned that there's Zamazamas who have gangs and are syndicate based, but they're treated all the same by the police. So as long as you look like you have a pick and a shovel, you will be brutalized. And sometimes it's on purpose. And that's what we're seeing more and more, is that sometimes it's targeted. But Tupili had operational challenges. I'm not going to go a bit into this because Lauren did mention a bit about Patupili, but it had challenges, some operational challenges and financial challenges. And we were mandated by ILRIG in 2020 to go on a fact-finding mission about what were the actual things that went wrong and went right at Batupili. And we noticed that one of the biggest things was not the actual permitting process, but what happened after the permitting process, and how the lack of training, the lack of support, the lack of information, and the lack of operational and financial training as well didn't happen, and it actually deterred the whole process of permitting. And it's only now that the Batupili is starting to get itself back together, and I've been working with them quite recently as well too. So they are looking to be more of a success story these days. So as NAM, we are calling for a total relook at the policy. We still think it's non-implementable. We think it's very airy-fairy. It doesn't make sense for the heterogeneous sector. Formalization must be from the bottom-up approach, and we feel that this policy was very top-down. It came from the DMR without actual understanding of what's happening on the ground. For example, one of the biggest things is saying the centralized bank, but we don't know how the centralized bank is going to work when there's no real understanding of how the trade, for example, of artisanal miners works. And if there's no real understanding of what artisanal miners do, how are they going to even be able to commit to having a centralized bank that will buy gold? So we know that in places like Zimbabwe, for example, where there was a project to have a plant where informal miners could process their material, it ended up failing because of the influx of artisanal miners, because they just didn't realize the sheer numbers. So this is one of the examples where you really have to do your research, not only on outside countries, but also in South Africa as well. Right, is con men and fraudsters. You find that artisanal miners get themselves into cooperatives and they start having some paperwork, but then they get in line and they try to get things in line, but next thing you know, con men and fraudsters buy their minerals for less than market prices. Excuse me. Research can provide an avenue to get data while making a difference. This is one thing that I think I speak about quite a lot, is that if we can actually use the research facilities, especially in research institutions, we can be able to see how the data changes over time. And we can see those things like growth, which is something called the ASM spotter. And I really recommend people look it down. It's spotter, SPOTTER. There was a success story in Guyana, and where they could actually see the movement of ASM over time, and they could track the hotspots using technology and satellite images. And then they could also see what type of rehabilitation needed to be done as the ASM was transiently moving over time. So this was something that is that is very technologically based, and we're moving with the 4IR revolution to actually aid in formalization of the artisanal mining space. Also, geoscience support data. For example, the geoscience database in the Council for Geoscience now, you can get all the boreholes. And this is something that we never had before. And this is something that can help the mining value chain when you're trying to build a basic geological model, which is necessary for an EIA to begin with. An environmental impact assessment needs a basic geological assessment. So, just to have that data, knowing that there's access to actually get boreholes and data in certain areas. But we need support systems for that, and we need buy-in from stakeholders. Growth from artisanal mining to small-scale mining is very important, because I find that even the miners themselves sometimes want to stay as artisanal mining. And I always say that I don't see a point in artisanal mining being artisanal mining just for the sake of being artisanal mining. There must be some sort of scaling up. And in this sense, artisanal mining should be looked at as an avenue for entrepreneurship and for growth into small-scale mining and maybe into medium-scale mining. I don't think artisanal mining needs to be a threat to large-scale mining, but I think there is an avenue for it to be working hand in hand with artisanal mining, especially because when we take note that in Kimberley, it was actually a joint venture. That's a kind of tributary agreement, as they alluded to in the policy. So the Batupili contract was actually a joint venture, and that's when they gave them the floors to mine. But even that's the case, there's still no technology. So they actually be using buckets and very basic technologies. And we saw that when we were there. And they can't even really mine the hard rock, which has the better quality of diamonds, simply because of the lack of technology. So this is some of the things that were outstanding that could have been there. How do we formalize? This question has been asked many times. And a lot of people often say to me, no, it's about regulation. No, we must get a law. But for me, I think we must define what we mean by formalization first. And just like a definition on artisanal mining, even this one doesn't really have a real definition. Nobody can agree on what is the definition of formalization. Is formalization when everybody has a permit who's an artisanal miner? Is formalization when we have laws in place? When do we consider it formalization? And I think at this point in time, the best thing to explore is to let the formalization grow from within the sector in itself. And I think it was DeSoto already in 2009. This is a paper. If anybody's interested in reading the paper, I think I can share it as well, Dale, if you want that. But what he was speaking about was how to get an extra legal economy back into being legal, sometimes you have to let the social structures within that system derive from themselves. And you basically base your legal system on the systems that are already socially acceptable. For example, tributaries or paying taxes to the state can be compared to the fact that in some customary and traditional areas, they pay tributes to the chief. They do actually pay some sort of monetary value, sometimes even in cows. They paid back to the chief for allowing them to mine there. So some of these systems are there in their own way, but it must be done in a way that makes sense for artisanal miners. What do I think is the way forward going on from this point? The biggest way forward, I think South Africa must realize that artisanal mining has long been sidelined, even though it was the birth of mining. And I like how David said, denying the history of artisanal mining is really denying the history itself. So I think that the main thing that going forward, first of all, is having global help, tapping into markets like the World Bank and other different NGOs across the world that aid in development and more specifically on artisanal mining. Working together with and collaborating with WITS, with institutions such as WITS, UJ, University of KZN, or wherever the case may be. And then also mapping, coming together and mapping and having a baseline study where and how we can actually see the progresses and the areas that are hotspots for artisanal miners. Fourthly, having a center of excellence. So where we have a database where we can have all information, whether a layman comes or whether a potential investor comes, they can have access to information of artisanal miners. And that would be based, obviously, if need be, in an institution that would be backing this research, where we would be able to look at artisanal mining as a possible economic driver. All right, I think I'll stop there, Dale. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kotatso. Thank you for that, again, informative input, and taking us through some of the more contemporary realities of what artisanal and small-scale miners are going through, and some of the challenges on the ground in particular, and demystifying as well some of those kinds of, how should we say, lies and myths as well. So I'm now going to, we're going to have a little bit of a question and answer session. And I know Comrade Lauren has to go to another meeting, so I'm going to give her the first bite if she would like to respond to any of these. I'm going to take the questions that have been put onto the question and answer. I'm just going to read through them, and if the respondents can just take note, or you can look at the question and answer. Also, if someone has, I see if you want to put your hand up, please do so, and I'll recognize you as well in a second round for that. So the first question is, to what extent is it true that some of the artisanal miners are in fact employed as independent labor by mining companies, both locally and internationally? Okay, and then the second question is, does the implied artisanal small-scale mining dependence on mining companies not take away their agency, freedom of choice and association, as well as ability to demand safety and security and a fair price and payment for their services? And then thirdly, from Comrade Eunice in Soweto, she's saying, we as a community around Soweto have a problem of mine dams, which is affecting much of our life and the communities. What are we saying about that? So those are the three questions there. And then in the chat function, there was a question around, how do we plan to make provisions for end-to-end production control in mining space to incorporate the industrialized process of engineers and refineries in order to open up markets? So that's a more general kind of question. And then also there is including considering organic certification of land after the full closure rehabilitation for agricultural purposes to expand our economy within small-scale mining. So that's another issue. Toto, go ahead, unmute yourself. I'm gonna, and then just ask your question.
All right, thanks. I'm audible.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, my question, I'm referring to Comrade Lauren with regard to law. I think sometimes 2019, 2018, there was artisanal miners that was arrested at George Harrison Park. I think they were arrested for 4 days. Then I think Eddie Makwati was with LRC by then. I forget the charge. I think they were charged after 3 days. Then these 2-3 days, they haven't been charged yet. So that was the concern. Then, but I forget, then they were charged after. Then after they were charged, on Tuesday when they appear on the court, they didn't even appear inside the court. The case didn't take it over. Then when we asked Stingley, who was representing the artisanal miners, then he said, magistrate said there was no law that speaks about the mining. So that's why they were released without anything. So I was asking with regard to law, because it happened at George Harrison Park, and now the police take advantage on that because they know when they arrest them, there's no charge for them. Instead, they want them 5,000 from artisanal miners. Then they know when they appear in court, there's no charge for them. They will be freely released. Thanks. That was my question.
Okay, thanks, Toto. Lauren, I'm just going to give you an opportunity to respond to anything, including a further question from Comrade Zetu about the possibilities of a class action lawsuit against for police brutality and robbery. Go ahead.
Hey, Dale. Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry that I need to leave. It's just this other meeting is quite pressing. I wanted to say, yeah, the question about independent labor, of course, artisanal miners can be independent labor. That's exactly what they are. They're entrepreneurs. They work by themselves. They don't work for companies. So they are entitled, if there is a contract in place, to obviously work for a company, locally and internationally. In terms of the dependence on mining companies, I think this is a huge problem. That's why it is problematic that the policy does not address the issue of, one, abandoned mines, two, large-scale mines, and obviously their role with artisanal mining. It speaks about very voluntary agreements being entered to, but I feel like artisanal miners are at the beck and call of your large-scale mines, and that's exactly what we need to fight about in terms of laws that will be following from this policy. In terms of Toto's question, I don't know if it was a question, but I do know about Edwin. Sadly, that sort of section of what the LRC was doing, is that work is not being done anymore. But I think it links to Zita's question about police brutality and about how police are implementing the law. And so in the policy, it does speak about amendments to the Policing Act. It does speak about, obviously, laws being implemented. And I think that's something that does need to be discussed. I think it's also what used to happen is having discussions with the police in the area is important through civil society, and taking police to task who don't follow the law, because there sadly is a lot of allegations of corruption. There's a lot of allegations of bribery, many allegations of police brutality, and police not really having a charge to charge people with, but just using the pressure that they may be doing something illegal to force them into positions to pay bribes, to have authority over them. So I think Zita's question is extremely important about a class action, about even just class action in the sense of not going to court. Just artisanal miners need to collect the stories. They need to build a database of police who have done things like bribery, like brutality amongst themselves. They need to collect enough information and evidence to be able to take it to someone to either look if there's a case or take it to IPID and show the names of the police officers involved. I mean, I obviously know IPID has not been effective, and I know IPID does have corruption in it, but the first step in any sort of idea of what kind of action can we take against a problem is collecting information. But that information needs to include things like pictures, records, medical records, names, places, dates, times. And that's really, really important, is that collection of evidence. And so I think that's the first step that, Zitus from NAM that's what we need to be doing, is collecting the stories, the information, the factual stuff, and then seeing what we can do with it. And hopefully that addresses most of everything, but I do need to go, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of this webinar.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren, for that. I'm going to now give the other two panelists, David and Hotatso, an opportunity to respond. I think, David, you heard the questions, and one particularly, I think, and Hotatso, both of you, the issue about independent labor and being employed by mining companies, the issue around their dependence on those companies and what the impacts of that, the issue about mine dams, and particularly, I know, David, you've been doing that work in Jagersfontein, where the mine tailings dam collapsed. So please, David, over to you to answer some of these questions.
First and foremost, I would like to talk about agricultural mining. We are working with Mintec, with one of the researchers there, to test the viability of agricultural mining, meaning planting plants that extract minerals from mine waste, which communities could do and they could benefit from, because the roots of those plants can be sold to refineries and processing plants. And in that way, the minerals can be extracted, the soil can be rehabilitated, and so on. And I think it's an important thing to consider for NAM and also small-scale miners. Then I think that people are asking about how do we make it safe and so on. We have suggested that they cluster groups of 5 or so operations of small-scale miners, and then they, through a variety of funding models that was mentioned a little bit by other speakers, but also possibly through a central buying agency for the minerals, to pay engineers and geologists and safety officers and so on to work with small-scale miners to make the operations more safe. And then the other one with regard to subcontractors and labor brokers, in Stilfontein last year, when 21 mine workers died underground, the relatives of those mine workers came to the Northwest Province, and I had a discussion with the Premier of the province. And the wife said, but our husbands were recruited by labor brokers and subcontractors. We thought that they were doing formal mining. We didn't know that they are doing illegal mining. And this is something that I've been referring to quite a lot, but people are not really taking it up. It's the issue of ghost workers, which has been in existence for a long time in the mining industry in South Africa, where mine management actually plunders the companies that they work for by employing ghost workers underground, parallel to the formal workers. And the reason for that is quite simple. A ghost worker, you don't pay pension, you don't pay medical aid, you don't have any of the expenses of a normal worker, and you pay them about 50% of the wage of a normal worker. And when push comes to crunch, then you say, I don't know anything about these guys, they are illegal miners. So that is something that really needs to be investigated seriously. And then finally, the issue of mine tailings and tailings dams and so on. The tailings dams pose a danger for the people in Soweto. Mainly those tailings dams are already dried out, so they're not likely to break like the one in Jagersfontein. However, the dust from those tailings contain arsenic, it contains uranium, it contains lead, it contains silica and so on, which give real problems to people in communities in Soweto. We know that teenagers in Meadowlands suffer from blood cancer quite a lot, for example, hemophilia. And we know that children in Snake Park are born with all kinds of deformities. And we suspect that all of this has to do with the mine dust that blow into the communities, because Soweto is southeast of the dumps, and the wind comes from the northwest, so it blows the dust right across Soweto and into the communities in Soweto. And people also have a lot of respiratory problems in those communities. And so the constitutional right of the Soweto community to mine health and safety is being denied. And this is a real serious problem that really needs to be addressed. And maybe it can be addressed through small and medium scale mining, I don't know, but something would have to be done about that. A lot of crime takes place in the mine tailings as well, as we saw with the rape of those people in the Krugersdorp area, in the Kagiso area. And interestingly, the community of Kagiso opposed the Mintails mining license 8 or 9 years ago when it was awarded. And the government just ran roughshod over them, deploying the police and tear gas and everything else to force them to accept that mining license, only for Mintails to abandon the mine and it posing all kinds of dangers for the community as a result. So when we talk about law enforcement, what concerns me is that the major mining companies can get away with murder. A child was run over today in Jagersfontein. I just got the message. A little girl was run over by a mine truck. And I can tell you now, those parents will have no recourse to the law whatsoever. And I doubt that they will get any kind of closure for the death of this child that happened today. So So the law in South Africa, the mining law, people talk about state capture. Frankly, the state in South Africa has been captured since the Cecil Rhodes, and all the laws that have been made around mining have been made to favor large-scale industrial mining, which is something that we are not debating or discussing, and we should be debating and discussing it, because we want to live in a democracy and we want our laws to favor the people. We don't want our laws to favor big industry. Big industry should be held accountable and should be regulated tightly, and their economic activity should be for the benefit of the people, not at the cost of the people. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Kotatso, would you like to come in and respond to any of those questions?
Thank you, Dale. Thanks, David and Lauren, for answering the question so well. Yeah, I'll just come in on the independent labor. One thing I think independent labor is linked to, and most people don't realize, is a sense of dignity for the artisanal miners. And so I definitely would consider them independent workers, because one of the biggest things is the potential of entrepreneurship and the potential of actually building a mining value chain. And I think the success story that I forgot to mention earlier, I don't know if I did, was Moyo Gems by Pact, where there's a group of women in Kenya. They were producing gemstones, and Pact came in through a World Bank funded project, and they managed to be able to produce gemstones that were even on Vogue and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes I know donors and all of that don't have the best interest of the people at heart, but what I'm saying is there can be multiple avenues to help drive this independency and help drive this social entrepreneurship for informal miners. And I think I just wanted to be quite succinct. I think the most important thing here is for the understanding that the artisanal miners now are having a voice and want a voice. And I think excluding them from any type of conversations or any type of policy development or any type of activity that affects them is really a no-brainer, because their voice is what we need to actually make sure that this works out. And the system can only be shifted or shaken from within the system. So the best thing that artisanal miners are trying to do are trying to align with the system so that they can be recognized. So yeah, I think at this point, I'd like to say thank you for everybody for attending, and thank you, Dale, for inviting me.
Thanks, Kotatso. We are now right on time in terms of our what we had advertised at 5:30. I don't want to, if there's any pressing question that anybody has or something that they feel has not been answered, I'll give one last opportunity before we just wrap up. But if not, just to say, first of all, Lauren Nell had to leave us just a little few minutes ago, but thanks to Lauren, thanks to David, thanks to Kotatso for very, very informative presentations. These, as I mentioned, I've noted the emails that have been put in the chat, but you can email me, also dtmckinley@gmail.com. I put that there if you would like to have a link to download the recording, or if you'd like the presentations. And Kotatso has promised also to send her notes, which will be useful. These will be good reference and resource materials for all of us as we, in our various capacities and others, continue to try to ensure that artisanal and small scale miners are not only, their rights are not only protected, but that we can move forward without the discrimination, without the bribery, without the violence and corruption, and to try to ensure that this particular sector of our economy, but also where many that are supporting many people, is regularized in some way that is empowering of those individuals. It's a difficult road. It's not easy. There are no easy answers here, but there has been quite a bit of progress. And also to demystify and to correct a lot of the misperceptions that are out there around artisanal and small-scale mining. So thank you to all of you as well who came on board. I know that now our participation has gone down a bit because we've lost some people, but thank you again. We hope that we'll be able to continue these kinds of events as well, and physically as well, as opposed to simply just online. Take care, be safe, and a luta continua. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.